Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. We are here at that glorious part of the year here in Arizona where it goes from nice to hot. I've already turned the air conditioner on. I think nice is in the rearview mirror. Maybe at night will be nice and cool. Of course, you're probably sitting in snow, so...
Yes. It just started snowing today, believe it or not.
That sounds about right. Apart from the snow, what's new and exciting in your world this weekend?
One of our listeners sent us an article about the Bayside Canadian Railway.
This means that whatever you say next is going to run the risk of being interesting. Somebody else actually sent it in.
This railway is located in New Brunswick, Canada. It owes its existence to a long-lived, little-known cartoon of a law called the Jones Act.
Cartoon of a law is a great way to put it, isn't it?
The Jones Act, enacted in 1920, requires, among other things, that shipping between American ports be done with American-built, American-flagged vessels. A growing problem in the United States is that regulatory burdens combined with more favorable foreign taxes and subsidies have resulted in few American-built vessels. In fact, today, China produces around 1,000 merchant vessels each year. The U.S. has a fleet of fewer than 200. That is, every 10 weeks, China produces a number of merchant vessels equal to the entire U.S. merchant fleet. And that makes it difficult for companies like the American Seafood Group to move its product between U.S. ports. It so happens that there's a loophole in the Jones Act that exempts goods that make part of their transit via Canadian rail. Now, don't look for logic here. The whole business, the Jones Act and its various loopholes, were written to protect favored industries. But here's the bottom line. American Seafood Group needs to move seafood from one U.S. port to another. The Jones Act requires that such transits occur on American-made, American-flagged ships. There are precious few of those in existence. But a loophole in the Jones Act allows goods to move from one U.S. port to another via foreign ships, provided the goods make part of their journey via Canadian rail. So what does American Seafood Group do?
Come on. I already see it. Come on.
It loads its seafood onto a foreign-made ship in Dutch Harbor, Alaska. The foreign ship sails through the Panama Canal, up the St. Croix River to New Brunswick, Canada, where it docks at a Canadian port. There, the seafood is unloaded onto trucks. The trucks are then loaded onto a waiting Bayside Canadian Railway train, where, and this is the fun part, the train runs 200 feet down a track and then reverses back the same 200 feet. The trucks then drive off the train and into the United States, having fulfilled the law's requirement that the goods complete part of their journey on a Canadian railway. There are so many lessons here that we could file this story under unintended consequences or cronyism or profit maximization or governmental waste. The point is that the laws designed to benefit favored groups often have to be so complex as to benefit who politicians want to benefit while maintaining the illusion of doing something else. And the more complex the law is, the more opportunity there is for people to act in ways to benefit themselves while maintaining the illusion of complying with the law. In the end, all that happens is that a majority of cronies benefit while businesses are encouraged to waste resources, customers are forced to pay more for goods they buy, and the big winners on both sides of the political divide are the politicians who, on the one hand, promise favors through laws like the Jones Act, and on the other, the politicians who promise to end the cronyism.
These ships go from Alaska to the Panama Canal, only to go back to Canada.
Only to go back to Canada, where they then run for 200 feet on a Canadian railway train before they can enter the United States. Astounding.
What on earth is wrong with everybody? And I want to point out that this is not the foolishness of the week. This is actually
right.
The serious thing that Ant wanted to talk about. My God.
If you go to the show notes, I've included a link to Google Maps that zooms in to this railway track. And it sits there. It's just a straight stretch. It's about 200 feet long, right next to the docks. And you can see there's a little ramp. The trucks ride up onto the train. It goes back, it goes forth, and the trucks drive away.
200 feet. That's not unlike what I would expect to happen when the engineer brought his children on board for their first time on a train.
Right. That's exactly right.
200 feet down, 200 feet back, let's go to Wendy's.
I've been on carnival trains that go further than that.
File all that away for a future rant, but for today we've got other rants. Joe Biden has declared there will be a new digital currency, and he instructs by executive order all manner of people to start doing all manner of things to get a digital currency. When I say digital currency, what's the first thing that pops into your mind?
Well, the first thing that pops into my mind is the IRS somehow allowing hackers to get in and get away with trolling through tons of IRS data that's supposedly secure. And now this is the same government that's going to create a digital currency.
All right, I should have asked what a normal person would have thought the minute they hear digital currency. And the correct answer is Bitcoin. Come on, man. That's what people think. We've got digital currencies all over the place. Some are serious enough, like Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Ethereum. Others are just nonsense. Dogecoin kind of fits this bill. What's an American digital currency going to look like? The short answer, not like any of those things.
Right.
It's not going to be built on blockchain technology. It's going to exist by fiat exactly the way our currency does right now. It won't be any different from what we have right now, except for one thing. Digital dollars are going to be traceable.
The big win here is for the government.
That's right. There will be literally no transaction you can make that won't have a bureaucrat peeking in at you.
None of the upsides of a regular digital currency, plus some downsides that digital currencies don't have.
Yeah, all of the downside we now have with fiat money.
Plus more.
And
right?
more.
Right.
What could possibly go wrong?
One group that's really going to get hosed here are waitstaff. All of a sudden, all these tips that you get that you don't count because it's cash, I know you're supposed to, no more. All of this will be traceable.
And this is going to be so onerous. I predict we will see much more by way of a barter economy.
Well, that's interesting. Just as you're saying those words, it occurs to me, if anything, this gives incentive for people to start using Bitcoin, Ethereum, and the other digital currencies.
Yep, that's right, because those are not traceable to the same degree. They are traceable, and the IRS is paying attention, but it's almost nothing compared to what this digital currency is going to look like. It bears pointing out that the reason why we have currency in the first place is because barter economies don't work particularly well.
Yeah.
We get currency as a storehouse of value. Well, now we're going to end up going right back to bartering, which means real inefficiencies. This is no way to start with a digital currency.
It's worth reminding people who think that the barter economy was all unicorns and rainbows, and you imagine that people aren't. People weren't greedy when we had barter economy. Money doesn't make people greedy. People are greedy, or they aren't. Money is simply a tool that they use. Money solves a ton of problems that currently we don't experience, but you will experience in full if you revert to a barter economy.
And it's still, Ant, not the foolishness of the week. Think about that for a second. I skip right past ruining the United States economy.
Not foolish enough.
and go to something else. And I start by asking, what do you know about Clarence Thomas?
I know that he had that run-in with Anita Hill a long time ago. He's a conservative Supreme Court justice.
Alleged run-in?
Well, he had a run-in. I mean, whether what was claimed actually happened, I don't know. And I think I saw some reference to something about his wife in the news recently.
This is the important part today. His wife, Ginny Thomas, is a very partisan Republican. She sent 29 text messages to the Trump White House pressing on this idea that Trump could just declare himself still president and somehow that would be okay. She's doing things that I think a rational person ought not do. But here's where it gets really interesting. We get calls first for Clarence Thomas to recuse himself from any number of cases that are anywhere near cases about the last election. I don't think I like that idea because Clarence Thomas has never given any impression that he's going to rule on things any other way than he wants. But people are calling on him to recuse himself. Okay, maybe that's fair enough. Maybe. Now we're getting calls for Clarence Thomas to be impeached.
Good Lord.
And who makes that call? It's Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, a congresswoman. These are the same people. I speak generally of the squad here. I speak more broadly about progressives generally in the United States. These are the people who would have us believe that women deserve to have a fully featured place in the economy or in the body politic that their husbands don't define. And here we are with a woman in the House claiming that the husband of a woman should be impeached because she doesn't like what he said.
So she shouldn't be defined by him, but he should be defined by her.
Exactly so. That's the message that gets sent here. And I think it's a dangerous message. If this had been a progressive on the court, I'm here to tell you she wouldn't have said a word.
We're back to politicians acting for outcomes rather than from principle.
Yes, that's right. And I think what we see more often than not are groups of politicians bereft of principle.
In her defense, politicians played to their base. The people who elected her to the House are not the people of the United States at large, it's the people in her district. And it may well be the case the people in her district are cheering, saying this is a wonderful thing. Even if she expects it to go nowhere, that's not the point. The point is that she get elected, which is the point of every politician.
Yeah, I wish I could disagree with that, but how on earth could I?
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. If you'd like to support Words and Numbers, make your way over to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers, where you can contribute to our podcast-making habits. If you'd like to schedule us to come speak at your event, be it corporate or educational, or have James officiate at your wedding, send us an email at wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com. Recently, James and I visited Mount Hebron High School in Ellicott City, Maryland, where we met with Mount Hebron's high school students. This is one in a series of episodes drawn from that visit.
Today, we're recording from Mount Hebron High School in Ellicott City, Maryland. In front of us are 150 students who comprise the largest and objectively most successful economics program in Maryland, likely in the country, possibly in the world. Under the direction of their teacher, Van Prime, the economics students at Mount Hebron participated in the National Economics Challenge, a competition among 10,000 high schools across the country. Mr. Prime's students have won the national championship 6 times, placed as national finalists 9 times, and won the Maryland State Championship 16 times. Not satisfied with dominating in the United States, the students have also participated in the International Economics Olympiad, where they won first place in the world. If you'd like to learn more about Van Prime's astounding students, look in the show notes for links to their media appearances. The students have submitted to us ahead of time some questions that they're interested in discussing, so we've picked some of the more interesting ones, and I have in front of me a 10-page document of over 120 questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we picked some of the more interesting ones and also ones that touch on topics that several students have mentioned. And we'd ask the students to come up and ask their question. We'll respond, and feel free to stay here if you have any follow-up questions that we can address, and treat this more like a conversation than a presentation.
EPI analysis of BEA and BLS statistics have shown a big deviation between wages and productivity that started in about the early 1970s. What do you think are the causes of this, as well as the long-term implications?
Yeah, this was an interesting question. It's one that people often bring up, prompted in part by politicians who also hammer on this, that over time we've seen dramatic increase in productivity in the United States that is not matched by an increase in wages. And there are a couple of important things to think about here. One is that the increase in productivity, it's not exclusively due to an increase in the productivity of labor, but it's also due to an increase in the productivity of capital. We have machinery, we have computers, we have things that can do things they couldn't do before. If you want a good example of this, think about something simple like digging a ditch. 100 years ago, it was a worker and a shovel, and the worker had some productivity. He could dig so many feet of ditch per hour with his shovel. Today, we have a backhoe. That same worker can dig far more ditch per hour using the backhoe. It's a tremendous increase in productivity, but it's not due to the skill of the worker. It's due to the machine. And so it's not necessarily the case that the increased productivity should necessarily be reflected in wages. If the increase in the productivity is due to the capital, it's due to the machinery, it should be reflected in an increased return to the investment in the machinery. And so that's one thing to think about. Another thing to think about is that workers aren't paid wages. They're paid compensation, which is the combination of wages and employer-paid benefits. And if you look over time from roughly the early 80s to the present, median wages in this country, adjusted for inflation, have increased about 6%. That's 6% more than inflation from 1980s to today. But if you look at compensation, the average worker's compensation has gone up 50%, 50% more than inflation over that same period. So what's been happening is, as our productivity increases, we are earning more money. It's just that it's showing up less in wages, more in employer-paid benefits. And the question is, why would that be the case? And at least part of the answer has to do with how we treat these things under the tax code. Your employer-paid benefits largely are tax-free, where your wages are not. So if your employer says to you, look, you're going to get a $1,000 raise this year, would you like it in the form of wages, or would you like it in the form of contributions to your health insurance, contributions to your retirement? If you take the latter, contribution to your insurance, contribution to your retirement, you get the full $1,000. If you ask for the former, the increase in wages, you only get $750, because that's what's left after the taxes. And so consequently, workers and employers, because of the tax treatment, have opted to take this increase in payment in the form of employer-paid benefits more so than in the form of wages, because of how we treat these things.
What is the best way for workers, the government, or other entities to prevent the exploitation of workers?
The first thing you have to do is define what exploitation of workers looks like. And here I'm not sure that we would have anything approaching a universal answer. I think that's going to be the sort of thing that people have very different answers over time and even among different people in the present. I'm not sure that I know what exploitation of workers looks like. It's one of those phrases that gets tossed around. I think what we would have to say is, if it's anything, it's that workers don't get what they should get in a free and fair open market on labor. So what gets in the way of that? And I'm not sure that we have a positive answer here in the United States. I think we generally have workers that are not exploited, with one glaring exception that I'll get to in a minute. But if you look globally, I think you will find answers to the question of what is exploitation. I lived in Iraq for a while. I thought I saw exploitation there. I've been to Amsterdam, where prostitution is legal. I think I saw it there too. Now, when you work here in the United States, we have laws that govern these sorts of things, and it's very difficult for anybody to skirt these laws. Some under-the-table jobs might, and those jobs usually go to immigrants who are not legally able to work in the country. So you can see where there might be an opening for abuse there. But a little known fact from my past, I used to work at mental institutions, group homes for people with developmentally delayed issues. And how they got paid was very interesting. They would have jobs, I would drop them off at their jobs, and they would get a check at the end of the week for like $37 for a full-time work week. And I dug into this a little bit, and for those people, and this was a law that was designed to get them work instead of being left at home day after day after day. The way the law works is that they get paid a percentage of minimum wage depending on how much they work. So if they produce 10% of the output that a minimum wage worker would produce, they get 10% of minimum wage. So you end up seeing these very, very small paychecks. I might make the argument that that's a kind of exploitation, but given that they had a place to live and they could go see doctors anytime, they had all the trappings of a pretty good middle-class life, even though they had no income. I don't know how you come to decide what's exploitation and what isn't. It's one of those things that you know it when you see it, but it's very, very hard to define.
We have a tendency to equate low wage with exploitation. I think you've got to keep these two things very distinct. James started off by saying exploitation is when you don't get what you should get in a free market environment. Now, a lot of people will stop that sentence partway through and say, well, exploitation is when I don't get what I should get. Yeah, but what does this mean, what you should get? Ultimately, what you should get is what you and your employer agree to. I would love to be paid $1,000 an hour to do my job.
You're not worth it.
My employer's not willing to pay that. Now, should my employer be forced to pay me $1,000 an hour to do my job? You start down that path and it looks like you're now exploiting the employer. My employer would like to pay me $0. I would like to be paid $1,000. Neither one of us are willing to deal with those extremes, and so we come to some agreement. If we come to an agreement that maybe isn't what either one of us would want in an ideal world, but it's something that we're both willing to live with, that to me says there is no exploitation here. Now, I may be in a situation where, because of my education or skills or experience or whatever, that I simply can't earn enough to support myself. Does that mean I'm being exploited? I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is because I think the cause of my problem isn't what my employer is willing to pay me and what I'm willing to work for. The cause of my problem is I don't have a skill set that's worth enough to enable me to support myself. Now, that's a problem that we should deal with, but I don't think it's a problem of exploitation. It's a different problem.
And that's exactly the minimum wage argument, that we should have a minimum wage because people tend to fall through the cracks. I'm comfortable enough saying that I do think people fall between the cracks. And then the question becomes not one of ends, but of means. How do we functionally address these problems? And that gets to be very, very difficult, especially when politicians become demagogues and say things like, well, every worker should be making $15 an hour. Well, by what standard? If you're not worth $15 an hour, what's going to happen when that minimum wage is implemented? You're going to lose your job. That's a form of exploitation too, I guess. If we're going to call the employment problem exploitation, then how is this not exploitation too? And you see just how difficult this becomes. Bernie Sanders can go on TV and say $15 an hour is what we need. And I'm here to guarantee that if he got that, there would be a new answer the next day. Then it would be 20. Then it would be 25. But the real question is, how much are employees worth to employers? Because if you fall below the line, if you cost more than you're worth, you will lose your job. And that's what we see every time the minimum wage is increased.
And I think one of the things that happens here is we lose sight of the reality of what's going on because the economy is so complex. If you want to see what's really going on, think back to a simple form of an economy. We're all farmers. We grow the food and we raise the animals that we eat. We're subsistence farmers. What do you do when you have a farmer who, maybe because he's not skillful, or maybe because his plot of land is not particularly fertile or whatever it is, but you have a farmer who simply can't grow enough food to feed himself and his family? Now, this is a problem, clearly, right? I'm not saying it isn't. It is a problem and we should do something about this. But what's the wrong thing to do here? The wrong thing to do is to say to the farmer, look, you can't grow enough crops to feed your family, therefore you may not farm at all. Now, clearly that's stupid. And yet that's exactly what we do with the minimum wage. We say to employers, you may only hire people who are worth $15 an hour. And if your labor happens not to be worth $15 an hour, well, you're just not allowed to work.
So my question is, what do you think is causing the recent rise of socialist thinking, and how has that impacted economics and politics?
The one thing you need to look at when you think about why it is that this quasi-socialist thinking makes its way into our public discourse is that it's a form of pie-in-the-sky thinking where people who think that they can organize a society this way also think that they can make everybody else better off. That's a very good message if you're looking to capture voters and public interest. So you're left with this problem. People can and do promise all kinds of things to people that, if you have any understanding of history, you'll know will never work. You can't point to that beautiful socialist environment in which everyone is happy and life is good. You can point to places like Venezuela where that was true for a little while until everything fell apart because nobody had any motivation, any incentive to keep up with capital problems. Every single thing that Venezuela needs to get oil out of the ground, they let die. It's very weird because they have the biggest oil reserve of any country in the world. and yet they can't get it out of the ground and everybody there is now poor. It's so bad that when people go to buy things, they don't count the money, they weigh the money. Imagine that. You have to have so many bills to put on a scale, and they weigh it and they do whatever they're going to do. So that's the end game of socialism. But the promises in the beginning are very, very tempting. Because what's going to happen? People who make a lot will pay some, and everybody else will live off that. Except that it just doesn't work. It's never once worked. Tens of millions of people have died in the process of trying to make this work.
I had something interesting to say, and it completely slipped my mind.
Yeah, I don't believe the former, I believe the latter.
I just remembered what it is. People say things like, well, socialism would work. The problem is we've never actually tried pure socialism. And that's absolutely correct. We never have tried pure socialism. But similarly, we've never tried pure capitalism, pure free markets either. And so we have no example we can point to of either one of those extremes. What we do have plenty of examples of, however, are societies that come closer or further away from the two extremes. And the data here is overwhelming, that the closer societies move toward the socialism end of the spectrum, the worse their socioeconomic outcomes are. And by socioeconomic outcomes, I mean all sorts of things you would point to that are indicative of a healthy society. Things like unemployment, poverty, equality, environmental outcomes, child labor, on and on. Those metrics, not in every case, but on average, degrade the closer the society gets to socialism, and they improve the closer society gets to capitalism. So we don't know what the two ends of the spectrum look like, but we do know what it looks like to slide back and forth across the continuum.
So my question was, what impact will rising gas prices because of the conflict in Ukraine have on the rest of the world?
Yeah, there are two things here. The price of gas and inflation. People often confuse the two. Inflation is a rise in the average price level. So the price of a particular thing going up is not necessarily inflation. It might be due to inflation, but inflation is a rise in the average price level. The rise in the price of gas is coincidentally happening at the same time that we're also experiencing inflation, rise in the average prices. And the rise in the price of gas, part of it is due to the overall inflation, but part of it is due to what's going on in Ukraine. And some things to think about. First, Russia exports 5% of the oil that the rest of the world consumes. So think about the total global consumption of oil, 5% of that is coming from Russia. So it's a decent chunk. It's not half of it by any means, but it's a decent chunk. If you shut that off, you're going to get an increase in the price of gasoline, though I don't think you're going to get it to the extent that we're seeing. I think the rise that we're seeing is due in part to that shutting off of the oil from Russia, but it's due, I think, even more so by the uncertainty. People don't know what's going to happen here. Is this going to be a long, protracted thing? Is there going to be nuclear weapons involved? Does this portend something that's going to happen between China and Taiwan? And so all of that uncertainty leads people, particularly investors, to be very skittish. And they are anticipating that price of oil will go up in the future. If they anticipate price of oil is going to go up in the future, they're going to start buying now, which causes the price to go up now. So I think a large part of what we're seeing is due to this uncertainty. Now, put the numbers in perspective. If you adjust for inflation, the price of gasoline today at whatever we're at, $4.50 a gallon or so, is not the highest we've ever seen. The highest we've seen historically was in 2008, where adjusted for inflation, it was what today would be $5.15 a gallon. In 2012, it reached a peak of $4.85 a gallon. And that's just the price of gas. If you account for the fact that when you buy a gallon of gas, you're not really buying gas. That's not what you're after. What you're after is the ability to drive your car a certain number of miles. If you account for the fact that cars today get much better gas mileage than they did in the past, the price of gas today at $4.50 a gallon is actually, adjusted for inflation and adjusted for mileage that cars get, the price of gas today is actually 25% cheaper than it was in 1981. Is it a shock to us? Absolutely. In part because we're used to gas being dirt cheap. It's part of why one of the students asked a question about transitioning to renewable energy. Part of why we're having such a problem transitioning to renewable energy is because fossil fuels are so incredibly cheap. Now, there's all kinds of footnotes to that involve government subsidies and this sort of thing. But the fact is, when it comes to what the person pays at the pump, they're incredibly cheap. And so our reaction to the $4.50 a gallon is less a reaction to the price being high than it is a reaction to we're used to the price being incredibly low.
But it's more involved than that, because if you think about gas and oil to a lesser extent, really what you're talking about is transport costs. So every single product that has to be moved from one place to another, which is almost every product, they're all going to be more expensive now.
Right.
And it gets awfully confounding trying to look at inflation and then temporary glitches. The pain of it all is that we won't know until next year which was which.
Yeah.
So when we start talking about these things, Anthony and I tend to be rather honest in what we don't understand. And that doesn't do you any good at all if you're trying to make a point in Congress.
Right. And James mentioned something interesting about the price of gas influencing the price of other things. Think about this next time you're in a grocery store. Look at the prices on the shelves of various things. Most of the price that you see is not for the food that you're buying. The bulk of the price that you're seeing is for the cost of transporting it from where it was manufactured or grown to the grocery store. It's like you're paying for the cost of transporting it and you get the food for free as a bonus.
And it's interesting to think about grocery stores. It's the one industry that we can point to, I think, that consistently has a razor-thin margin of profit.
Right.
It's about 2%. So when you look around and you see that coffee has gotten more expensive and the package has gotten smaller, well, yeah, that's the grocery store trying to keep up with the pricing that they face. And they end up making about 2%, which means every time a governmental entity says you must pay more for X, usually labor, the end result is almost always that grocery stores close. This happened in California just recently, where a set of, I think it was 12 or 15 grocery stores, a local government foisted a very high minimum wage on them specifically. And they shut down the stores and went home because they just couldn't make a profit anymore. And of course, what happens next? Those same governmental actors say, well, you've created a food desert. And that's correct, but it was the government who caused it.
Let's say the conflict escalated into something more like a war with more countries getting involved. In previous wars, it has sometimes benefited the U.S. and helped the economy grow. How do you think it would affect in this case?
That's a misconception, and it's something I was taught when I was in high school, that we're in the Great Depression. What got us out of it was World War II, and consequently, wars are good because they boost the economy. And that's like saying, this is a bad analogy, maybe I shouldn't say it. Well, I'm going to say it because I can't think of a better one. It's like saying spending money on a party is good for your consumption because you spend money on a party and you have lots of food and drink and this kind of thing, and that's clearly good. And you're missing the point that I can spend lots of money on food and drink, but then I've got to pay for that somehow. Particularly if I put it on my credit card, it means for the next 2 months, I'm going to be eating ramen noodles to pay back for this spending that I did. So really what happened is I didn't suddenly boost my standard of living. I shifted my standard of living from the future to the present. And that's what a war does. It's part of what a war does. It shifts our spending from the future to the present. So yeah, you can get a boost in the economy because of all this military spending. And for the next 10, 20, 30, maybe even 50 years, our standard of livings are going to be slightly lower as we try to pay back for all of that. And that's not even counting the fact that when you have a war, what are you doing? It's not only this spending, but you're destroying a bunch of stuff. And now we've got to rebuild these things that we destroyed. So you're at a net loss here.
We have to rebuild those things in lieu of building other things.
Right, yeah.
Now, the United States has traditionally done quite well when Europeans go to war. We're better off here, given our geographical isolation. We're far better off here than our friends throughout Europe who just get tattooed. And then here comes the Marshall Plan. So American taxpayers are paying to rebuild. Can it ever be an unalloyed good? And I think no is the correct answer here. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have gone to shut down Nazism. I don't want to make that case at all. Of course we should have. But you have to look at things in a sober sort of way and understand that if we do that, there are costs. Are we willing to pay them? Under certain conditions, yes. And under other conditions, not so much. And you see the kind of arguments that are being made right now. People remember only too well Iraq and Afghanistan and the never-ending war, that the minute we leave, it all goes right back to the way it was the day before we got there. And we think about that when we look at places like Ukraine. We ask an obvious question: what's our business there? And I'm not sure there's a great answer to that question. Poland, which borders Ukraine, now we've got a pretty good answer because Poland's been in NATO for many a year, and we've agreed to help them. I think we might welch on that agreement. I think we might say, well, we meant it at the time, but not right now. Who knows? Putin has nuclear weapons. It means he can do all kinds of things, and he can expect that he won't be countered. The Chinese, I think, are looking at Taiwan right now, asking what's happening with Ukraine. And if Putin grabs Ukraine, I think the Chinese grab Taiwan in exactly the same way. So you have to worry about the lessons you're teaching people, too. Not only this idea that wars cost, but how wars cost. And that's the interesting part.
I'd follow up with, to anyone who says, well, World War II is what got us out of the Great Depression, I would challenge them to look at statistics for the United States and for other countries, because the Depression here was a 10-year event. From the start until we got involved with World War II, roughly 10 years of serious unemployment and reduced GDP. Look at the same period for other countries. Look at Canada, look at UK, look at France. And what you'll find is those countries similarly suffered dramatic unemployment at the start of what we call the Great Depression, but they came out of it within about 18 months. It was in the United States that it lasted a decade. Now, what that tells me is whatever it is that brought people out of the Great Depression, it wasn't World War II, because everybody else got out of it 9 years earlier. It was only us that stayed here for 10 years. So that raised the question, what was going on in the U.S.? And if you delve into that, you'll find a number of things between some misguided governmental policy and some misguided Fed operations, Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve in the Great Depression did, in a lot of ways, the exact opposite of what it should have done. Do you know about the stock market crash of 1987? You do. Well, of course you do. You're Mount Hebron students. Of course you do. I asked any other students, if you heard of the crash of 87, nobody knows what I'm talking about. The crash of 87 was gargantuan, stock market crash, like this crash of 29. But 6 months later, you would have had no idea that there was a stock market crash in this country. Why? Because in 1987, the Fed did what it should have done. What if it had done back in 1929, the 1929 crash similarly would have been done in 6 months. But the Fed did the exact opposite in 1929 of what it should have done. It actually made the situation worse.
I actually remember that crash in 87 because I had just gone to college and there were a bunch of college students all wondering how their parents would afford to pay their tuition for the next year because everybody got eviscerated with that one event. It's hard to explain how bad it was to people who didn't live through it. And then it's hard to explain how bad it was for people who did live through it because it was over pretty quickly.
It's also interesting, the change in the psychology. In 1929, the stock market crashes, and the stock market, I don't want to say was a new thing, but in terms of the general populace, it was a relatively new thing. Not many regular people like us invested in stocks, and when the thing tanked, people panicked. They want to get out of the stock market. They want to pull their money out of the banks, the whole thing. In 1987, when the stock market tanked, I didn't hear one person say, I've got to get out of the stock market. No. In fact, I heard many people say, oh my God, I wish I had $10,000. This is the time to buy.
And because I was a teenager at the time, I didn't. But fast forward a bunch of years to 2001, I remember walking downstairs on September 11th, watching planes literally crash into buildings. And then over the next bunch of days, you start monitoring the financial markets. U.S. equities got taken outside and shot.
Yep.
I mean, they just bled value for a long, long time. And about the 2-week mark, I took every dime we had and bought into it, figuring, okay, either it comes back and we're a healthy nation, or it never comes back and we're...
In which case, you got bigger problems.
That's right. It's not going to matter what I've done anyway. And it turns out that was, I would say, the single best investment I ever made, but it might be the only best investment I ever made. And you start to realize that when you think that way about American markets, you actually get a lot further because over time they tend to creep up. Now you can buy at a very bad time, but if you have a long enough time horizon, you tend to get through it. And I think absent the use of nuclear weapons, that's largely going to be true until our economy crashes because of the debt. when that come to roost, I think all of what I said is off.
I think we have a question coming up later on about the debt. I disagree with some of what James said, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah, we don't agree on everything, which people think we do, for obvious reasons.
He's wrong about something.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
But until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend.
Well, that's an interesting twist. Be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it.
Being nice to people who deserve it is easy.
That's easy, right?
Being nice to somebody who doesn't deserve it is really hard. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.